why do electric vehicles will always outperform hydrogen cars?
Going through the hydrogen energy flow, you lose 65% of your energy. Going through the EV electric flow, you lose maybe 25%. You just need way less electricity. You can charge your EV at home or at work or public charges. The electricity grid is basically everywhere. On the contrary, there's basically nowhere to fill up your hydrogen car.
So converting hydrogen to ammonia and then using container ships all around the planet, is this the future that we're headed to?
Probably not, but except in a few different cases. So it's true that cost of producing green hydrogen varies a lot in different parts of the world because it's basically dependent on how cheap are your renewables. And so it's true that in those cases, ammonia as a way to kind of level the spreads between green hydrogen is useful. There will be some trade in ammonia, but will we be shipping around ammonia in large quantities as an energy source? Seems unlikely just because you lose so much energy. You're starting with electricity to convert into hydrogen, to make into ammonia, to ship, to convert back into hydrogen and then back into electricity, you're going to lose like more than 80% of your energy. Unless your energy is like that much cheaper, source versus destination, that's really hard.
The billion-dollar question. As investors, where should you place your bets?
There is a lot. It's linked to incredibly cheap renewables. If your wind, but more likely solar, can get really cheap and you can produce hydrogen really cheaply in certain parts of the world, what does that mean? And it could mean making synthetic fuels from hydrogen, so either sustainable aviation fuel or synthetic natural gas. To the extent that renewables get that cheap that you can just rip out kerosene or different fuels in certain parts of the world, that's pretty exciting.
Welcome to the Climate Insiders podcast, where top climate thinkers, entrepreneurs, and investors share revolutionary ideas and insights. Tune in to learn from the visionaries shaping a sustainable future. Let's dive in. Ben, welcome to Climate Insiders.
Great to be here.
It's a real delight to have you. This episode is going to be slightly different. We thought that there's a lot to be said about hydrogen and fusion. There's a lot of unknown out there and a lot of people are confused on what that all means. And so instead of a full Q&A format, I thought I would leave the floor to you for a quick expose, a little interesting kind of high-level understanding of hydrogen first, and then we can dive deep into fusion. And my role is just going to be as a sort of moderator, asking questions, trying to bring tips, tricks, all the key highlights that we should make sure to be aware of. And so, yeah, hopefully that's going to be a great, interesting conversation.
Sounds great.
So why don't we start with hydrogen first? So the floor is yours. I'll give you kind of 10, 15 minutes to kind of give us the high-level overview of hydrogen, and then I'll ask questions.
Perfect. So yeah, hydrogen, an emotional topic for I think lots of people. Lots of people feel very dogmatically about it, and it's a complex topic. So we'll try and break it down sector by sector. And so maybe we can start with why hydrogen is important at all. And I think there are two main reasons here. First is that we already make and use a lot of hydrogen. So we make about 100 million tons of hydrogen already, and mostly that's for making fertilizer and for chemicals and refining. And so we still need to use that hydrogen in future, but instead of having it come from fossil fuels, we need it to be clean. And the second reason is that lots of the things that we might want to make in future, like green chemicals, green fuels, they contain hydrogen as a critical ingredient. And not just is hydrogen a critical ingredient, but it's also a big cost center for these things. So if you want to make clean ammonia for clean fertilizer, if you want to make clean sustainable aviation fuel, clean methanol, or renewable natural gas, any of these things, they all contain hydrogen, and you can't make them cheaply unless you have cheap green hydrogen. Nonetheless, hydrogen is overhyped by a lot of people, particularly fossil fuel companies and gas companies, because they see hydrogen as a replacement for natural gas. And if you own pipes, you want something to continue putting through your pipes so you don't become irrelevant. And so there's a lot of hype beyond what is reasonable around hydrogen. And so maybe we can start with where it makes sense to use hydrogen. Because the thing about hydrogen is a very flexible fuel. So you could use it to decarbonize a lot of things. You could use it to decarbonize industry, transport, heating, flying, shipping, power. It's possible to use hydrogen for all these things, but it doesn't make sense to use it for lots of them. Because in lots of these areas, there are better alternatives like electrification. In lots of these areas, you can use different things that are just more efficient than hydrogen. I'm going to break down some different areas that we definitely should use hydrogen for in future. So these include things that we already use it for today. As I mentioned, ammonia, chemicals, and refining. We need to keep doing that, but with clean hydrogen. Then there are some things which we will definitely need it for in future, which are new. And that includes aviation fuel and shipping fuel. So we're going to need some flying and some shipping in future. And we'll be able to replace some of that with electrification in different modes. But for long haul flights and for long shipping journeys, we need energy-dense fuels. And we can use biofuels for some of that. But biofuels are limited because you're limited by your supply of plants. So plants are competing for food production, for land area. And so there's a limited supply of biofuels that we can use. For the rest of shipping and aviation, we're going to need some alternative fuels that are made from hydrogen. So that's an important area that we need hydrogen for. Then there are some areas which hydrogen may be useful, but there are other alternatives for as well. So steel is an example of this. There are various ways to make green steel. Lots of them involve hydrogen. Lots of them, well, some of them don't. For example, if you can just recycle the steel that you have already in an electric arc furnace, that's a great way to decarbonize your steel. Actually, the US is already doing this really well. Like 70% of their steel is already recycled. But for new steel, we will still need some hydrogen for that. Also in the maybe bucket, there is hydrogen for power generation. And this is really controversial because you can take electricity, you can use it to make hydrogen, and you can turn that hydrogen back into electricity. And so you could use this to store energy or even transport it to other countries which maybe are energy poor. So you could take hydrogen, you could make hydrogen where there's a lot of energy, say from solar power in Africa, and you could export it to places which are energy poor or have limited energy resources like Japan. This is controversial, of course, because you waste so much energy doing this at every step that it's just a very expensive thing to do, and you really shouldn't do it unless you have no other choice. And then finally, we have things which you definitely shouldn't use hydrogen for. And the main two things in this bucket are cars and home heating. And, in the past, it was kind of, you could argue that there was a debate here, at least for cars, because it wasn't clear whether batteries were going to be better and, electric cars were going to be better or hydrogen fuel cell cars were going to be better. Now it is completely clear that batteries will win. I mean, they just keep getting cheaper every single year. This year, already the price of lithium batteries is nearly down half. They're down 90% in the past 10 years. Electric cars will win. They're more efficient. They're basically better on every metric. So you shouldn't use hydrogen for cars. Likewise, for home heating, you can do that with electricity rather than hydrogen. You can use a heat pump or other forms of electrified heating to heat your home, and that will use 5 to 6 times less electricity than if you use that electricity to make hydrogen and then burn it in your home. So that's kind of a rough overview. Maybe we can talk about how we actually make hydrogen today and the greener methods of making hydrogen. So today we make hydrogen, and we refer to different ways of hydrogen production using different colors. So today, most of our hydrogen production is what's called gray hydrogen. That means we make it from natural gas. So we mix natural gas with steam, just hot water, and that produces hydrogen and also CO2. So we got the hydrogen, but we also emitted a ton of CO2. Hydrogen today is like 2% of CO2 emissions and 6% of natural gas usage. So that's dirty and we don't like that. We also make some hydrogen from coal in some places like China. So we want to clean it up. There are kind of two mainstream strategies to do this. First one is called blue hydrogen, which is just where you attach carbon capture to your existing process. And of course, carbon capture is controversial. It doesn't always work. But we can say that for hydrogen, it definitely does work, because if you live in Europe and you have fizzy drinks and beer or CO2 from a fire extinguisher, it was probably captured from a hydrogen plant. So most of the CO2 in Europe comes from capture, from making hydrogen for fertilizer. And the reason we do that is it's much easier to capture CO2 from hydrogen than other industrial processes, because the CO2 is really concentrated in the output. So that's blue hydrogen. It's still not ideal because you're still using natural gas, you're still using fossil fuels. Natural gas is, of course, methane, which can leak into the atmosphere and is a really potent greenhouse gas. So then we come to the exciting way to make hydrogen, which is green hydrogen, which is how most of our hydrogen will be made, or at least should be made in the future. Green hydrogen is really simple. You just take water and you pass electricity through it. And water is H2O. you pass electricity through it, it splits into H and O. So you get your hydrogen and you get some oxygen, which is fine. So it's really simple, but the issue is that it also uses a lot of energy. So you're putting electricity through this water to split it into two, but you need a lot of energy to do that. And to give you an idea of the scale, the International Energy makes forecasts for how much hydrogen we'll need in future. And they expect that in 2050, the amount of electricity that we will need to make green hydrogen is bigger than the amount of electricity that the US and China use today, just like in total. So it's pretty huge. And maybe that's an overestimate, but it's still a ginormous amount of electricity that we'll need for green hydrogen. And this is like a great example of why we should use electric cars instead of hydrogen cars. Because if you use an electric car, you start with electricity, you use it to charge a battery, and then your battery turns the motor, your motor drives your car. And in that process, you've passed your electricity through the power grid and the battery. Maybe you've lost about 25% of the power, but mostly it's a pretty efficient process. If you were to use a hydrogen car, you use your electricity to make your hydrogen, you compress it, store it, transport it, put it through a fuel cell in your car. All of these steps are very lossy. You lose a lot of energy, and you might waste 65% of your energy doing that. So it's a way more efficient use of electricity to use electric cars than hydrogen fuel cell cars. And then the last thing to say on this is, if we're going to use so much electricity to make green hydrogen, where is it going to come from? Because we're talking about a huge amount of electricity here. And how much will it cost? And this raises an interesting question around cost. If I just take my hydrogen electrolyzer, which is the machine that makes green hydrogen, it's just a fancy name for 2 sticks and some water. If I take that and I connect it into the power grid, I'm going to need a lot of electricity. So it takes about 50 kilowatt hours of electricity to make 1 kilogram of hydrogen. And to put that in context, a kilowatt hour of electricity on the grid costs you maybe 10 cents, at least in the US. It's a little higher in Europe and it varies, but let's say 10 cents. That means it costs me $5 for every kilogram of hydrogen to make green hydrogen. And I can already go and buy gray hydrogen from fossil fuels for like $1.50 in the US. So it's already way more expensive before I've even built the electrolyzer or the equipment or the infrastructure just to buy the electricity. So green hydrogen depends on a cheap source of electricity. And the cheapest place to find electricity is renewables. Renewables, when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing, it's the cheapest electricity we've had in history. And so the question is, can you find excess power from renewables that's really cheap that you can connect your hydrogen producing machine to and soak up that power? So that's kind of the $1 million question. And it's also really hard because electrolyzers are quite expensive. And so if it's only going to be running 10% of the time when there's excess cheap power, that's a hard deal. I want to pay it back quickly. So that's a big question in hydrogen as well. I'm going to leave it there and wrap up by just saying hydrogen is really important. We're going to need it for several different things in the future. It's a critical ingredient and critical cost center. It's overhyped in lots of sectors, particularly by the fossil fuel industry, and it requires a lot of energy. So we'll leave it there.
Looking to make smart investments in climate tech? Subscribe to the Saturday Climate Insider newsletter. Every Saturday, I'll send you one actionable tip to navigate the climate tech investment landscape. Join over 3,500 investors who are already gaining exclusive insights and strategies. Subscribe today. Amazing. Thank you so much. Wow. What a great expose. All right, let's go through rapid fire. I'm going to try to spit as many questions as possible so we can uncover and dig deeper. You mentioned the electrolyzer space, and that's definitely one of the bottlenecks of the expansion of hydrogen. What are the key innovations that need to happen to reduce the cost of electrolyzers globally and to make the green hydrogen more viable?
Great question. So there are a few different types of electrolyzers. And historically, a lot of research has focused on making electrolyzers more efficient. And that's really important because the more efficient you can make your electrolyzer, the less energy you have to use to make your hydrogen. But we're actually getting pretty good at this now. So I mentioned that it takes 50 kilowatt hours a kilogram to make hydrogen. The theoretical minimum that we physically can't go below is 40 kilowatt hours. So we're actually pretty close already. So there's not a huge amount of breakthrough tech that we can make to make it take less energy. That's just a fundamental. But we can make electrolyzers that are cheaper. And we can make electrolyzers that require less maintenance and less degradation, because these things have to be replaced as you make more hydrogen. They kind of corrode and degrade. So making stable electrolyzers that are cheap, that can be transported into different places, or can be situated in different places and matched well with both their supply, so they can cope with spiky power from renewables, as well as output hydrogen at the right pressure and the right conditions that is needed.
Hydrogen cars versus EV cars. Why does it seem so obvious to you that there's not even game here? Why do electric vehicles will always outperform hydrogen cars?
Yeah, so there's the electric efficiency that I mentioned before. In both cases, you're starting with electricity and you're ending with the movement of your car. As I said, going through the hydrogen energy flow, you lose 65% of your energy. Going through the EV electric flow, you lose maybe 25%. So you just need way less electricity to use an EV. There are also just a ton of logistics. You can charge your EV at home or at work or public charges. The electricity grid is basically everywhere, so you can recharge your EV, and EV charging infrastructure is only getting better. On the contrary, there's basically nowhere to fill up your hydrogen car. And building that infrastructure is really difficult. And one reason for that is that hydrogen just isn't a very dense fuel. So to give you an example, if I wanted to convert all the petrol stations around, UK or Europe or wherever to hydrogen, currently we do a lot of that by pipeline or by tanker. So, you see these big tankers on the road that are taking diesel into a certain station. If I wanted to put hydrogen in a trailer and do that, I'd need like 10 of them to get the same amount of energy in as one tanker of diesel, because it's just less dense. So the infrastructure is really difficult, and it's tricky.
So transport is a real challenge, even for hydrogen. What are the primary challenges associated to it? Why is it especially difficult to source it from areas where we have a ton of space? So you mentioned, for example, the global south. We could potentially place solar panels and solar panels in the middle of the Sahara, create a ton of hydrogen, and then pump it through a pipeline system to Europe. Enjoying the podcast? Make sure you don't miss an episode by subscribing to our YouTube channel. Click the subscribe button now and stay updated with the latest in climate innovation.
Yeah, good question. So there's a few different ways you can transport hydrogen. One of them is by ship. There's one hydrogen tanker in the world at the moment. And that's because transporting hydrogen, pure hydrogen by ship, is pretty difficult. As I say, it's not very dense, which means it takes up a lot of space for a certain amount of energy. And that means you either have to cool it down to a very, very low temperature and keep it at that temperature to compress it, or you have to store it at a very high pressure, so like 300 bar. And so that's tricky. There are better ways to do that. So we could convert it to ammonia, which actually is a much more dense way to ship hydrogen around. But that also contains issues because you're converting it to another chemical, and then you have to do the opposite at the other side. You crack it back into hydrogen, and both of these stages lose more energy. So you're worsening your energy efficiency even more. So shipping is hard. Pipelines is also a good question. We could build new pipelines. People also talk about putting it through existing pipelines. That's also problematic because hydrogen is the smallest element, which means it leaks really easily. And hydrogen is just a nightmare to transport. Most of the hydrogen that we use today is used right next to where it's produced because people make hydrogen and then they really quickly turn it into something else because it's just a pain to handle. I mean, like even NASA, who's pretty great at engineering, they're always having hydrogen leaks that are like delaying the launch of their rockets. So it's a nightmare to store and transport.
What about flammability?
Flammability is another issue. So yeah, you all heard of the Hindenburg, pretty bad. And hydrogen in general it's very dangerous, which again is why when we make hydrogen, we quickly turn it back into something else. So yeah, it's an issue.
So converting hydrogen to ammonia and then using container ships all around the planet, is this the future that we're headed to?
Probably not, but except in a few different cases. So it's true that the cost of producing green hydrogen varies a lot in different parts of the world because it's basically dependent on how cheap are your renewables. So in some parts of the world with loads of solar and wind, it's going to be really cheap to make your hydrogen. In other places, it's going to be more expensive. And so it's true that in those cases, ammonia as a way to kind of level the spreads between green hydrogen is useful. And then there will be some trade in ammonia. There's already a lot of trade in ammonia because we ship it around for fertilizer. But will we be shipping around ammonia in large quantities as an energy source? It seems unlikely just because you lose so much energy. If you're starting with electricity to convert into hydrogen, to make into ammonia, to ship, to convert back into hydrogen and then back into electricity, you're going to lose like more than 80% of your energy. And so unless your energy is like that much cheaper, source versus destination, which it might be in some places, but won't be in most, that's really hard.
Why do you consider there's a controversy to blue hydrogen? So carbon capture, efficacy might be a problem. How effective is it, the carbon capture technology, and why using hydrogen in the mix doesn't seem viable?
Yeah. Carbon capture in general is controversial because it's very expensive and it has a long history of not working. Lots of the places that we've installed carbon capture, they don't work very well. We didn't end up capturing much of the CO2. And the reasons for that are that the incentives aren't very well aligned. If you're a company and you're doing your thing and it's spewing fossil fuels, there's no gain to you by installing carbon capture on it. It just costs you a lot of money to run because carbon capture uses a load of energy. And so you're going to end up using so much energy for no financial gain. And so that's one reason why carbon capture has failed in the past. But why do we talk about it for hydrogen? Hydrogen is a place where we definitely could capture the carbon from. And as I say, the reason for that is that it's very pure, the output of the CO2 from a hydrogen process. So compared to something like, let's say, a gas power plant, the purity of your CO2 coming out of there might be like 4% or like 12% for a coal plant. For a hydrogen production process, the purity of your CO2 is like more than 50% or sometimes close to 100. So it's much easier to capture your carbon from a hydrogen plant than another plant. So if you're going to be doing carbon capture, hydrogen is a good place to do it.
Now, the billion-dollar question. As investors, where should you place your bets? What are the most exciting research areas that you think could revolutionize this space? And what are the particular niches or sectors, subsectors that investors should pay close attention to?
Great question. There is a lot because hydrogen covers a number of different sectors. Personally, what I'm excited about, as far as opportunities that like hydrogen will radically change things, it's linked to incredibly cheap renewables. So if your solar, if your wind, but more likely solar, can get really cheap and you can produce hydrogen really cheaply in certain parts of the world, what does that mean? And it could mean making synthetic fuels from hydrogen, so either sustainable aviation fuel or synthetic natural gas. To the extent that renewables get that cheap that you can just rip out kerosene or different fuels in certain parts of the world, that's pretty exciting. So I think any view of future hydrogen and future opportunities has to be paired with what is the energy source. And if you can achieve a really good coupling of the energy source suits your project and the output suits your location in the world as well, then that's essential.
And what are your predictions over the next 10, 20, 30 years out for the hydrogen economy?
I think I'm pretty skeptical on a hydrogen-powered economy. I don't think that it will be ubiquitous in our lives or in industry for many of the reasons that I mentioned. Electrification will just win, and you're in a race with something which is getting cheaper every year. But in certain niche sectors, hydrogen will have to become prevalent and clean hydrogen will have to ramp up, or else we will continue burning fossil fuels to make hydrogen, which is not an option. So it's important. It will grow to probably at least double the output of hydrogen that we have today. But I don't think it's going to be 5 times the output that we have today.
Ready to make a substantial impact on our planet's future? Join the Climate Insiders community today. We are a group of investors committed to supporting all moonshot startups that are tackling climate change head on. Become part of a new generation of climate investors and help us create a sustainable future. Visit climateinsiders.com to join now.